Hi, I'm Jessica Roy. I'm a senior lecturer at University of Bristol in Child and Family Welfare. And this presentation talks about my PhD study, which looked at outcomes for children who live with parental substance misuse, particularly relating to the children's social care system in England. So, as with the situation internationally, parental substance misuse is a significant public health and children's rights issue in the UK. And children who live with parental substance misuse are at increased risk of experiencing maltreatment. It's very difficult to estimate, but up to 30% of children living with a parent who's misusing alcohol or drugs in the UK. Now, the children's social care system in England takes a broadly protectionist approach. That is a system that's focused on protecting children from significant harm, as opposed to more family-orientated or support approaches in other parts of the world. My interest in this topic comes as a social work professional who moved into research, and I was interested in exploring children's longer-term journeys in, through and out of the social care system, particularly in the context of parental substance misuse. Alongside that, I was interested in exploring what factors might increase or decrease the likelihood of harm for children and young people. So the study itself was a retrospective longitudinal case note study, and I collected data from 299 children's case files. And children entered the sample if, in the initial referral, assessment, or during the first phase of social care intervention, a concern, which was either substantiated or not, was raised about parental substance misuse. And substance misuse included alcohol and drugs, or drugs. And this was a very broad criterion for entry, and deliberately so, mindful of the fact that much parental substance misuse goes unidentified, and parents and children will often not share information about substance misuse with professionals for fear of what might happen. And my interest was in both parents and carers, so anyone who took on a caring role for the child. So that might include step or social parents, parents' partners, kinship carers, as well as people like grandparents. Identifying children via this route required hand sifting, reading and coding of information by myself as the researcher. There are referral and assessment codes for social care in England, some of which refer to parental addiction and parental alcohol and drug misuse. Now, while these codes did pick up some children who were living with parental substance misuse, the vast majority were not coded by social workers using these codes. So there were a lot of false negatives, hence the reason that I hand sifted through information. And I collected data about those 299 children from the initial or index referral to children's social care in 2012 and followed them retrospectively until 2014. And I collected information from referrals, assessments, court reports, minutes of meetings. So essentially for some children this was a significant amount of data. Data was collected into Excel spreadsheets and then analysed using SPSS, using a mixture of bi- and multivariate statistics. So before I talk a bit more about children's outcomes and what related to them, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the sample themselves. So who were the children and families that my study was about? So in terms of age, the children were aged between unborn and 17. On average, they were about 6.5 years old, with a median age of 6. And as a note, some of those children were referred as unborn children with concerns about parental substance misuse. And they were split broadly between boys and girls. In terms of living arrangements, at the point of initial referrals to children's social care, 40% lived with their birth mother and 33% lived with both parents. However, it's worth noting that many children had changes to their living circumstances, including where and with who they lived across the 2-year follow-up period. In terms of substances being used by parents, alcohol was by far the most common, with approximately 75% of children living with a parent who was misusing alcohol. Cannabis was the next most common substance, with 24% of parents misusing that, and 10% of parents were misusing opioids, so primarily heroin, but also other opioid-type substances. And over a third of children, so about 34%, had more than one parent or carer who was misusing substances. Now, identification of substance misuse on the social work case file was often late. That that is that it wasn't on the kind of primary reason for referral, and it was identified later in the assessment or intervention process by the social worker or another professional. And this probably won't come as a surprise to many of you, but children who were living with parental substance misuse were often living in households where there were other issues which might negatively impact on their well-being and their safety. So notably, 43% of the children in the sample were also experiencing domestic violence and abuse. And it's notable that from my analysis and reading of case files, professionals and parents often made connections between the substance misuse and domestic violence and abuse. So, for example, episodes of domestic violence occurring when the perpetrator of violence or the victim survivor was using substances, and so the police were called, which then meant referrals to social care. Finally, under a third of the children, so 28%, had a parent or carer in some form of substance misuse treatment. This was quite a kind of wide definition, so it included court-ordered attendance at treatment, methadone maintenance treatment, as well as kind of support to try and reduce or abstain from substances. So I explored children's social care outcomes, the statutory outcomes or interventions that they became subject to across a 2-year period. And the figures on this slide are cumulative, so across the 2 years this is the number of children who became the subject of the specific intervention. So 41%, just under half, became the subject of a child in need plan, and this is a kind of voluntary plan that kind of requires the parent or carer's consent, so it's not a statutory plan. 30%, so just under a third, became the subject of a child protection plan. And these are statutory interventions, and most child protection plans were made under the category of either neglect, so that was 46% of children, or emotional abuse, and that was 43% of children. 16 of the children in the sample came into the care of the local authorities, that was just around 5% during the 2-year follow-up. Half of those were placed in long-term placements with extended family or friends, so kind of kinship care arrangements, with the other half in local authority foster or residential placements. And then 17 children, their cases remained open to children's social care for the whole 2-year follow-up period, so really kind of extensive intervention and assessment by social care for those children. And in terms of re-referrals, about 40% of the children in the sample were re-referred to children's social care during the follow-up period. So essentially they were referred for the index referral, they were assessed, their case might have been closed, but then at some further point they were re-referred back due to ongoing concerns about the child's well-being. So during the first stage of analysis, it was clear to me that there were kind of patterns of outcomes, and there were kind of evident different types of trajectories in, through and out of the social care system. I was interested in exploring this further, and so I used a combination of cluster analysis and also thematic analysis of the case file data to identify particular trajectories through the social care system. And by doing so, I identified 5 types of kind of longitudinal outcomes that were evident in the group of children that I looked at. And I, as well as identifying those types, then analysed what factors might be associated with those different outcome types. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So the first type that I identified were what I called the multiple intervention types. This was 32 children. And these children experienced multiple different social care interventions over the 2-year follow-up. In total, 27 became the subject of a child protection plan, 15 of a child in need plan, and 16 came into the care of the local authority. And for 17 of the children, their cases remained open to children's social care for more than 2 years. So these were children whose cases remained open for very long periods of time and were kind of subject to those significant levels of intervention, which reflect kind of high levels of concern about children's well-being. Analysis showed that children in the multiple intervention type were significantly more likely to be living with kind of household instability, and that instability was represented by specifically being left in the sole care of a parent or carer who was under the influence of substances, but also experiencing multiple household changes. So that may be changes to the child's main carers, changes to household composition. And also for children in this type, there were professional concerns raised about the parents' willingness or ability to engage with social workers around the concerns that they had. The next type was what I called the re-referral type. This was just 24 children, so the smallest type. But the children in this type experienced multiple re-referrals to children's social care over the 2-year follow-up. So these children were all re-referred twice to children's social care during the 2-year follow-up, with some being re-referred 3 or 4 times. Now, some of the children in this type did receive a kind of longer-term social care intervention in amongst those re-referrals. So 19 of the 24 became the subject of a child in need or child protection plan, or both. But the analysis of case file data indicated that these plans were either preceded or followed by a number of referrals, which would suggest that these interventions were either delayed or ineffective. Analysis showed that children in the re-referral type were significantly more likely to be living with a parent who misused cannabis, and this group of children were also more likely to be experiencing elements of household or family instability. So, for example, having parents who misuse multiple substances and be experiencing kind of housing problems as a family. The next type of outcomes that I identified were children in what I called the child protection type. This is 52 children. Now, all children in this type became the subject of a child protection plan. But unlike the re-referral type, they were not re-referred multiple times to children's social care. And unlike the multiple intervention type, they didn't experience lots of different interventions. The child protection plan was a kind of discrete one-off intervention that was relatively short-lived. And all the children's cases were closed within the 2-year follow-up period. Now, children in this type were significantly more likely to be experiencing family housing problems and that kind of across the 2-year follow-up, and they were also much more likely to have a sibling or a half-sibling who had been or was currently in the care of the local authority, and often this was sometimes the reason for the referral to children's social care. For some other children, there was a kind of significant sort of trigger incident of concern that had prompted the initial referral and intervention from children's social care. The next type was what I called the child in need type. And as you may have guessed, all children in this type became the subject of a child in need plan. Now, this type was almost identical to the child protection type, but the difference being that those children became all the subject of a child in need plan rather than a child protection plan. Children in this group and their families tended to have kind of more support around them, kind of able to offer support to parents and carers. And like the children in the child protection type, this was a relatively kind of short-lived, discrete intervention. The final type was what I called the closure type, and these children were referred to children's social care at the beginning of the 2-year follow-up period. They were subject of an assessment, but then their case was closed. They didn't experience any kind of specific ongoing intervention from children's social care beyond that initial referral or assessment. Now, as you may expect, there were far less concerns raised in relation to these children and their family life. One kind of indicative feature was that in the referring or precipitating incident, there had been an incident of domestic violence and abuse, but then the abusive partner, most commonly the father or the mother's partner, had left the house, and that was kind of deemed to make the situation safe for the child or young person. So what does this tell us about kind of interventions and outcomes for children who live with parental substance misuse? So the typology, I think, demonstrates that there's a small group of children who are at a high risk of harm. So children in the multiple intervention type and the re-referral type appear to have the poorest outcomes over the 2-year follow-up period, and they appear to be the most likely to be suffering or likely to suffer from significant harm over an extended period of time. Now, critically, some of those children who were experiencing significant harm were well identified by social workers. So the children in the multiple intervention type had extensive intervention from social care in their lives, and they were kind of under a kind of assessment or different plans to hopefully ensure or protect their safety and well-being. By contrast, the poor outcomes for children in the re-referral type were indicated not through different interventions, but through the number of re-referrals they experienced. And all children in this type were re-referred at least 3 times to children's social care during the 2-year period, with some being re-referred more than this. So that re-referral type represents a quite small proportion of children who had high numbers of re-referrals. And these re-referrals can really potentially indicate that children are experiencing kind of periods of time where they are at risk of harm, but it's not being kind of adequately addressed potentially by the professionals around them. And even though there were interventions put in place, they appeared to be quite delayed, so they were preceded by a number of re-referrals, or ineffective in that they occurred, but then a number of re-referrals happened after those interventions. On the other end of the spectrum, the closure types, the largest type within the sample, were a large group of children who appeared to have, I suppose, the most positive outcomes in that they were not assessed to be in need or at risk of harm, unlike the other 4 types. But context dependent, we could argue that some of these children would have been better supported through other services and not necessarily referred into the children's social care system. Identifying those children who were at more or less risk of harm presents significant challenges in kind of social work and wider professional contexts, particularly I think in the context of parental substance misuse, where the use of substances by parents is always seen to kind of create potentially a risk of harm to children, and so sometimes the other issues going on in family life might be a little bit lost. Critically, the most obvious indicator that professionals may look for, the amount of substance someone is using, or perhaps the number of days of week they use, were not particularly useful indicators of actually how much risk of harm the child was at risk of, certainly in relation to the findings of my study. Now, partly this may be because the information that social workers are getting and recording might not be particularly reflective of what's actually happening in reality. But secondly, the kind of amount or number of days someone was using was, and the impact it had on the household and child, there were much more kind of relevant factors to consider in relation to kind of the risk of harm, and I'm just going to talk about them on the next slide. Oh, sorry about the different animations there. So a key risk factor emerging from this study really was that the instability of caregiving associated with parental substance misuse as a result of either having both parents misusing substances or being left in the sole care of a parent who was misusing. Instability was also indicated by there being kind of multiple changes to household composition, for example, changes to who the child's main carer was, who else lived in the household, and where the child lived. And associated with that were kind of high levels of domestic violence and abuse amongst children who had the poorest outcomes. And as is known from extensive existing literature in the field, experiencing domestic violence abuse as a child has significant negative impact, and one of which is kind of increasing instability in people's lives. Critically, how kind of chronic issues was key to understanding children's trajectory and outcomes. So one-off concerns about stability or substance misuse did not particularly appear to be associated with poor outcomes, but when those issues became chronic, so they're happening over longer periods of time, they did. And this reflects what we know about substance misuse more broadly, which is that kind of use of substances is likely to be something chronic affecting families over extended periods of time. Finally, in some situations, there were concerns raised about parents' capacity to meet children's needs, and these were often related to kind of household stability or kind of stability in parental responses to children and young people, for example, around meeting emotional needs, but also kind of the physical stability of the household. So were they able to provide for a child's basic needs? Now, these kind of findings about the particular risks that might increase the risk of harm to children do kind of echo and reflect what we know from research with children who have experienced growing up with parental substance misuse. And I'd particularly like to point to a recent systematic review by Muir and colleagues which articulates this really well. So the final slide really kind of thinks about, I suppose, conclusions, but kind of what does this data mean? So from my study, it would appear that there are children at the threshold margins for statutory interventions in children's social care who were not well supported or identified, particularly those children who were repeatedly re-referred to services without receiving support in a more consistent way. Now, this raises, for me, a question about how we can improve assessment and identification for children who may require support in the context of parental substance misuse. Secondly, it was kind of notable that service provision, and what we know more broadly is that service provision around parental substance misuse and supporting children and families in this setting is patchy and limited. So in the first instance, it's quite geographically dependent. But the second, there are kind of good, notable high-end interventions. So for interventions for where there are really significant concerns about children's safety and well-being, and where perhaps there's a risk that child might be removed from the care of their parents or carers. So the Family Drug and Alcohol Court is a very good example of that. Although I would note that that is very geographically dependent, and the vast majority of families who interact with the Family Court wouldn't have access to it. Critically, there is a limited amount of support and intervention for children at the lower end of concerns about child welfare, and this is where the majority of children actually sit. So those are the children who don't meet the threshold for statutory intervention, but who are living in households where there is parental substance misuse, but perhaps many other issues affecting child welfare, such as domestic violence and abuse. Given the array and chronicity of issues identified and affecting children in this study and others, it's evident that support services need to engage with different aspects of family life and not solely be focused on parental substance misuse. And I think there can be a risk that parental substance misuse is seen as the risk in a child's life, and insufficient attention is paid to other aspects of that child's life and the family's life that may need support and intervention. And connected to that, sorry, I've gone on to the final slide and I didn't mean to, but connected to that, it's also important that support is potentially in the longer term and not just short one-off pieces of intervention. So thank you for listening, if anyone ever does to this, and to reach out to me with questions. My email address is on that slide there, and here are the references for the presentation. Thanks so much.